Let's begin with an overview of the chatbot in the Watson Assistant interface. First, the welcome node fires at the beginning of the chat, and all this node does is prompt the user to enter some data to be processed. After that prompt, the chatbot jumps to the child node called calling webhook, waits for the user input, and then prints the message calling the async webhook. Then the chatbot jumps right down to the node called call async wrapper webhook. This node is configured to call the async wrapper endpoint of the sample Node.js app with the parameter str set to whatever the user input is. The async wrapper should return an HTTP 200 right away, so we'll just print that result so we can see what's happening under the covers. The purpose of the async response node is to handle the message coming from the web chat API containing the results from whatever the asynchronous web service is sent. To make this work, we have an entity called async response. It's a pattern entity, and to match it, all that needs to be true is that the user input has these letters, async response, just like this. It's a pattern entity. So the async response node is triggered when a message comes in that contains that text. When a message comes in that contains that text, we can grab the asynchronous result out of that message using a regular expression. And then the node just prints that so we can see it. The purpose of the anything else node is just to print a message when user input comes in that doesn't match one of the previous nodes. Now let's walk through the code of the sample Node.js app. In the file server.js, you can see the chatbot endpoint. That's going to serve up our web page that contains the chatbot. Next, you can see the async wrapper endpoint. That's what the chatbot is configured to call. This endpoint returns HTTP 200 right away so that the chatbot can continue on its processing synchronously, and then calls whatever asynchronous web service you need to be calling. And then when results come back from the asynchronous web service, a message is sent to the ongoing conversation in the chatbot. In this sample app, the way that message is sent is using socket.io to send information to the JavaScript in that web page that's hosting the chatbot. And for the purposes of demonstration, our so-called pseudo web service endpoint that we're calling is actually this endpoint, async endpoint. To demonstrate that some processing has happened, this just takes the input text and turns it around backwards. And what it's doing is just having a timer for 10 seconds long before returning any results. Okay, let's see how this plays out. Here's the web page where the chatbot is hosted. I'm going to start a chat, and you can see the welcome node fires prompting me to enter some data. So I'm going to enter blah, blah, blah. Then that gets sent to the webhook, async wrapper, and the HTTP 200 response comes right back. Then I could continue chatting with the chatbot if that made sense for your use case, and when the asynchronous results come back, you can see the message coming from the web chat API with the async response text at the beginning, and then the blah, blah, blah backwards. And so in your real application, whatever logic makes sense for you, you'd carry on now that that asynchronous result comes back. Let's run through that again, this time with the browser debugger open. There's the welcome node. There's my input. Async wrapper returns HTTP 200. Now, after a little delay, the async response comes back. Remember, in the server, we're sending that response through socket.io. Here's the JavaScript in the chatbot.ejs file. You can see we receive that asynchronous result. In the routine message chatbot, you can see we take that asynchronous result, the blah, blah, blah backwards, and then we prepend that async response text that's going to trigger the async response node in the chatbot, and then we send that to the chat using the web chat API.